Thompson. Mr. Clarke, as we sit here this afternoon, we have your book, and we have your press briefing of August 2002. Which is true?
Well, I think the question is a little misleading. The press briefing you're referring to comes in the following context. Time magazine had published a cover story article highlighting what your staff briefing talks about. They had learned that, as your staff briefing notes, that there was a strategy or a plan and a series of additional options that were presented to the National Security Advisor and the new Bush team when they came into office. Time magazine ran a somewhat sensational story that implied that the Bush administration hadn't worked on that plan. And this of course, coming after 9/11, caused the Bush White House a great deal of concern. So I was asked by several people in senior levels of the Bush White House to do a press backgrounder to try to explain that set of facts in a way that minimized criticism of the administration. And so I did. Now we can get into semantic games of whether it was a strategy or whether it was a plan or whether it was a series of options to be decided upon. I think the facts are as they were outlined in your staff briefing.
Well, let's take a look then at your press briefing, because I don't want to engage in semantic games. You said the Bush administration decided then, mid-January, that's mid-January 2001, to do two things. One, vigorously pursue the existing policy, that would be the Clinton policy, including all of the lethal covert action findings, which we've now made public to some extent. Is that so? Did they decide in January of 2001 to vigorously pursue the existing Clinton policy?
They decided that the existing covert action findings would remain in effect.
Okay. The second thing the administration decided to do is to initiate a process to look at those issues which had been on the table for a couple of years and get them decided. Now that seems to indicate to me that proposals have been sitting on the table in the Clinton administration for a couple of years, but that the Bush administration was going to get them done. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, that was my hope at the time. It turned out not to be the case.
Well, then why in August of 2002, over a year later, did you say that it was the case?
I was asked to make that case to the press. I was a special assistant to the president, and I made the case I was asked to make.
Are you saying to me that you were asked to make an untrue case to the press and the public and that you went ahead and did it?
No, sir.
What are you saying?
Not untrue. Not an untrue case. I was asked to highlight the positive aspects of what the administration had done and to minimize the negative aspects of what the administration had done. And as a special assistant to the president, one is frequently asked to do that kind of thing. I've done it for several presidents.
Well, okay. Over the course of the summer, they developed implementation details. Principals met at the end of the summer, approved them in their first meeting, changed the strategy by authorizing the increase in funding fivefold. Did they authorize the increase in funding fivefold?
Authorized, but not appropriated.
Well, but the Congress appropriates, don't they, Mr. Clarke?
Well, within the executive branch, there are two steps as well. Within the executive branch, there's the policy process, which you can compare to authorization, which is to say, we'd like to spend this amount of money for this program. And then there is the second step, the budgetary step, which is to find the offsets, and that had not been done. In fact, it wasn't done until after September 11th.
Changing the policy on Pakistan, was the policy on Pakistan changed?
Yes, sir, it was.
Changing the policy on Uzbekistan, was it changed?
Yes, sir.
Changing the policy on the Northern Alliance assistance, was that changed?
Well, let me back up. I said yes to the last two answers. It was changed only after September 11th. It had gone through an approvals process. It was going through an approvals process with the deputies committee, and they had approved it. The deputies had approved those policy changes. It had then gone to a principals committee for approval, and that occurred on September 4th. And those three things which you mentioned were approved by the principals. They were not approved by the president, and therefore the final approval hadn't occurred until after September 11th.
But they were approved by people in the administration below the level of the president and
Approved.
moving towards the president. Is that not correct?
Yes, over the course of many, many months, they went through several committee meetings at the sub-cabinet level, and then there was a hiatus, and then they went to, finally on September 4th, a week before the attacks, they went to the principals for their approval. But of course, the final approval by the president didn't take place until after the attacks.
Well, is that 8-month period unusual?
It is unusual when you are being told every day that there is an urgent threat.
Well, but the policy involved changing, for example, the policy on Pakistan, right? So you would have to involve those people in the administration who had charge of the Pakistani policy, would you not?
The Secretary of State has, as a member of the Principals Committee, has that kind of authority over all of foreign policy issues.
Changing the policy on the Northern Alliance assistance, that would have been DOD?
No, Governor, that would have been the CIA, but again, all of the right people to make those kinds of changes were represented by the 5 or 6 people on the Principals Committee.
Well, they were also represented on the smaller group, were they not, the Deputies Committee?
But they didn't have the authority to approve it. They only had the authority to recommend it further up the process.
Well, is policy usually made at the level of the Principals Committee before it comes up?
Policy usually originates in working groups. Recommendations and differences then are floated up from working groups to the Deputies Committee. If there are differences there, policy recommendations and differences are then floated up to the principals, and occasionally, when there's not a consensus at the principals level, policy recommendations and options or differences go to the president. And the president makes these kinds of decisions by law. In fact, many of the kinds of decisions you're talking about can only be made by the president.
And you said that the strategy changed from one of rollback with al-Qaeda over the course of 5 years, which it had been, which I presume is the Clinton policy, to a new strategy that called for the rapid elimination of al-Qaeda. That is, in fact, the timeline. Is that correct? It
is, but it requires a bit of elaboration. As your staff brief said, the goal of the Delenda Plan was to roll back al-Qaeda over the course of 3 to 5 years so that it was just a nub of an organization like Abu Nidal that didn't threaten the United States. I tried to insert the phrase early in the Bush administration in the draft NSPD that our goal should be to eliminate al-Qaeda. And I was told by various members of the Deputies Committee that that was overly ambitious, that we should take the word eliminate out and say significantly erode. And then following 9/11, we were able to go back to my language of eliminate rather than significantly erode. And so the version of the National Security Presidential Decision Directive that President Bush finally got to see after 9/11 had my original language of eliminate, not the interim language of erode.
And you were asked, when was that?
Governor, one more question.
When was that presented to the president? And you answered, the president was briefed throughout this process.
Yeah, the president apparently asked on one occasion that I'm aware of for a strategy. And when he asked that, he apparently didn't know that there was a strategy in the works. I therefore was told about this by the National Security Advisor. I came back to her and said, well, there is a strategy. After all, it's basically what I showed you in January. It's stuck in the Deputies Committee. She said she would tell the President that, and she said she would try to break it out of the Deputies Committee. And
So you believe that your conference with the press in August of 2002 is consistent with what you've said in your book and what you've said in press interviews the last 5 days about your book?
I do. I think that the thing that's obviously bothering you is the tenor and the tone, and I've tried to explain to you, sir, that when you're on the staff of the President of the United States, you try to make his policies look as good as possible.
Well, with all respect, Mr. Clarke, I think a lot of things beyond the tenor and the tone bother me about this.